Okay, welcome everyone to the final session in this series of Oxford Development Talks, the series that is trying to take the best of research in international development and make it accessible as widely as possible. I'm delighted to be joined for this session by Professor Matthew Gibney, who is Professor of Politics and Forced Migration here at the University of Oxford. Matthew is Director of the Refugee Studies Centre, and his research focuses on the politics and ethics of questions around refugees, citizenship, and migration. And his work has been prolific, but I think he's perhaps most famous for his book, The Ethics and Politics of Asylum, published by Cambridge University Press. And Matthew's going to speak on a topic that is relevant at all times, the question of should states abolish immigration restrictions, but is perhaps also particularly timely now in a context when governments around the world are imposing significant travel restrictions in ways that are having impacts on refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, and travellers of all sorts. So Matthew's going to speak to us, I think, for about 30 or 35 minutes. Set up the parameters for a discussion, and then we'll have a chance to have a question and answer session. And if you've got ideas while Matthew's speaking and want to ask a question or raise a point, please feel free to enter them in the chat box or the Q&A box, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. And thank you very much for joining us at a time of year which is usually the time when we expect to be going off on holiday, but when things are still, to some extent, continuing. Matthew, over to you, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much, Alex. Thanks for that kind introduction, and thank you to everyone watching. I know you're a slightly captive audience because of the circumstances, but it's very nice to have you regardless. So what I want to talk about today is the moral legitimacy of immigration restrictions. Now, immigration restrictions, it hardly needs saying, are a central point of political controversy across many countries in the world today. Border controls serve in some cases as a fault line between global north and global south, between the circumstances of security and insecurity in political arrangements, between opportunity and deprivation, and even in some circumstances as a kind of colour line that we're particularly conscious of at the current time. As such, immigration controls can tell us a lot about society's attitudes to equality, race, humanitarian responsibilities, and historical relationships. Other than that people argue, often acrimoniously, about whom their society will admit, whom it will exclude, and how many immigrants shall enter. Now, much contemporary debate is about how states should exercise their discretion to control entrance, and that states have extremely wide legal latitude to impose or repeal restrictions is a central starting point of government, international law, and general public understandings of immigration. In recent years, however, political philosophers have fundamentally challenged this idea of discretion, articulating moral constraints on immigration controls far in excess, in many cases, of what most contemporary states currently accept. They've increasingly constructed immigrants as rights holders who are entitled to enter states that in practice often seek to exclude them. Now, what I want to do in this talk is to offer a tour d'horizon of some of the key arguments philosophers have employed to show that immigration restrictions violate the moral rights of non-citizens. Now, admittedly, it's a slightly weird time to have this discussion. The spread of COVID-19 would seem to provide a powerful justification for border restrictions in many parts of the world. COVID confronts us with a rare situation where immigration may be dangerous to the health and even the lives of the citizens in the countries of reception. But the situation that pertains to COVID is, I'm sure you'll agree, a pretty exceptional one, and one that we all hope will not last. In the operation of immigration restrictions, the most fundamental interests at stake are typically those of the people trying to enter. The risks of perishing from COVID are hardly the same as the magnitude of the risks of crossing the Andaman Sea in a crowded open boat. And the rigors of domestic isolation pale into insignificance against the experience of being detained in an immigration detention centre. Of course, the contrast is not always so stark. People migrate for many different reasons and do so under a range of different conditions. Moreover, countries differ in the possession of resources that they have to protect their own people from the virus. That said, in this talk, I'm going to put aside for the most part the unusual issue of COVID. We may come back to that in terms of our discussion, however. In my discussion this afternoon, I'm going to look at immigration restrictions through the lens of the aspiring immigrant. The limitation of this approach is that it means that I'm going to have little to say about positive claims in favour of border control, claims that many national communities make. I won't, for example, talk about the claims of self-determination or communal autonomy. The discussion of these ideas is true necessary for full consideration of the morality of immigration controls, but I don't have time to cover this territory today. Instead, and less ambitiously, I want to highlight 4 distinct moral claims that political philosophers have thought might justify conceiving of immigrants as rights holders in terms of entry, and therefore challenging this broad discretion of states. The specific claims I shall deal with are, in turn, claims connected to principles of liberty, equality of opportunity, democratic legitimacy, and finally, what I'll call historical membership. If any of the arguments I present this afternoon is valid and we can debate and discuss those, then there's a powerful case for questioning the current prerogatives of states as conceived in the realm of immigration control, and perhaps the moral acceptability of immigration restrictions altogether. But just a couple of caveats before I begin. While I'm going to present arguments from moral philosophy, I don't put these forward in the naive belief that good moral arguments are in themselves likely to sweep away border control. Immigration restrictions obviously exist because some actors have the power and the resources to mark their territory, to draw lines, and then, to a greater or lesser extent, police these lines with guns, guards, and restraints. That said, it's also apparent that governing elites frequently draw on moral arguments to justify the use of immigration restrictions to their citizens and sometimes to foreigners. They appeal to their country's moral right to national self-determination, to the exercise of what they conceive of as a collective property right, or to threats posed by foreigners who are often constructed as unworthy or criminal. In so doing, they implicitly acknowledge the power of moral understandings to influence people's actions. It's hardly naive then to look at and to examine moral claims as they relate to border control. Furthermore, I'm not going to consider the specific claims of refugees here. The moral and legal claim of asylum for refugees is one that states generally accept, at least in principle. Instead, I want to focus on entrants who have somewhat less dramatic interests at stake. People who migrate because they're seeking work, reuniting with families, or looking for better opportunities for themselves and for their children. Let's move on then to think about what moral resources aspiring entrants might draw upon to claim entry in a world of sovereign states often hostile to their claims. One claim that philosophers have thought that the entrant might make is this: allow me to enter, or you will be violating my fundamental liberty. This particular claim has been developed by liberal political theorists in particular. They've argued that immigration restrictions are in tension with a fundamental human right to freedom of movement. While this argument has been articulated on both the liberal left and the liberal right, its most influential exponent is the Canadian philosopher Joseph Cairns. Cairns argues that within liberal societies, the individual's right to move freely about is widely considered crucial to individual autonomy. The right to move freely about, unimpeded by state restrictions, is important both in its own right and because is important in its own right because no one would think that one could be free if all one's basic needs were met, but one was confined, for example, to a cell all day and night. But also because it's crucial to the realization of other key rights and the protection of important interests. Unless we can move around our society, go where we want to go, and even exit our state, we cannot exercise rights of freedom of association, our right to a private life, the right to seek out appropriate and desired work, or to engage in activities particular to our personal life plan or conception of the good. As Kieran Oberman has noted, freedom of movement also has an important political dimension within states. How can we keep our government accountable if we cannot move freely around and talk to people and see the effects of its policies and practices? How can we mobilize against it unless we can freely associate with others of like mind? A society that restricts movement is not an open society because in it we could not properly identify and contest arbitrary uses of power. Liberal societies generally acknowledge then the importance of this freedom by allowing people, including non-citizens in most cases, to reside and travel where they want once inside the territory of the state. It is restriction of movement, conceived of as violations of negative liberty, that needs to be justified, not going and living where I want. Now, not all states are like this. Many states control freedom of movement and residence in order to promote the public good. Communist states like Vietnam, China, and the Soviet Union long required residence permits to live in particular cities in order to present overpopulation and over-urbanization. In times of war, liberal states have controlled the internal movement of people, and today we see wide-ranging constraints as a result of the COVID virus. But such constraints generally make liberals uneasy and are viewed as legitimate only if they're exceptional, temporary, and driven by a powerful necessity. Now, the key point for Joseph Cairns is that given that freedom of movement is widely considered a defining feature of freedom within the state, why should we put aside considerations of liberty when it comes to the question of international movement between countries? After all, as Cairns says, every reason why one might want to move within a state might also be a reason for moving between states. One might want a job, one might fall in love with someone from another country, one might belong to a religion that has few adherents in one's native state and many in another. If someone has the right to move from Oxford to Cardiff to be with the love of their life, or to take up a university place, or to join a political group, why should they not be able to move from Ghana to the UK to do the same? The suspicion is that this asymmetry has little to do with liberal principles. Rather, the right to move freely is being truncated in order to accommodate racism or xenophobia, or to protect special group privileges that couldn't be impartially justified. So, in Cairns' view, there is something deeply hypocritical about straining our right to move freely within states. Liberal principles, for him, demand a world of open borders. Now, Cairns' claim of an arbitrary disjunction between the domestic right to move freely and international restrictions hasn't convinced everyone, and not even all liberals. David Miller has recently provided 2 reasons why he thinks we should treat domestic and international movement differently. First, he argues that while international freedom of movement may be important, it's simply not as vital as domestic free movement, and therefore doesn't rise to the level of being a human right. For most people, and refugees here are an obvious exception, they can find within their state an adequate, if not unlimited, choice of options in terms of jobs, partners, political associations that is required for a meaningful life. Extending their range of choices to what is available globally is more like a luxury, he suggests, than a necessity for most people. Second, David Miller argues that when the state controls our internal movement, it puts itself in a position where it can dominate us. The history of internal restrictions on freedom of movement showed that states often use these restrictive laws to control unpopular minorities and political dissent. Think of the effects of the past laws in apartheid South Africa. Immigration restrictions, on the other hand, simply prevent people from entering a particular state. They're not intrusive or domination enabling in quite the same way. They simply prevent entry. Now, these are quite powerful objections, but they don't completely put to bed the inconsistency involved in limiting freedom of movement to the domestic realm. Certainly, they don't challenge the idea that eliminating immigration controls would expand the scope of human freedom. Now, let's turn to a different type of argument. Claim for entry philosophy or the immigrant could make is, allow me to enter, or you will violate my right to be treated according to fundamental principles of equality. In this view, the main ethical problem with immigration controls lies not in their violation of liberty, but in the way that they create or reinforce inequality between societies, and thus between people. The classic liberal way of formulating this argument involves an appeal to the idea of equality of opportunity, the idea that people's progress in society, their access to jobs, services, rights, and entitlements should be determined by merit and not by arbitrary considerations such as race, gender, sexual preference, or even perhaps luck. Even if one thinks that economic inequalities can be justifiable, they are illegitimate if they are the result of discrimination on the basis of arbitrary characteristics. Now, needless to say, the world is characterized by breathtaking economic inequalities. And these inequalities may be hard to justify in any terms at all if one believes that all people are owed a minimal standard of living and resources. And it's also evident that these inequalities are partly cemented by state borders and the regime of national citizenship. Where one is born will determine one's access to a range of opportunities, goods, public services, and even protection for one's basic civil and human rights. We see this simply enough in the realm of life expectancy. In Sweden, the average life expectancy is currently 80.4 years. In Chad, it is around 49 years of age. According to the legal and political theorist Untitled Chapter, what we have in the world today is a birthright lottery imposed by the regime of national citizenship. She suggests that citizenship in the current international system is like a form of inherited property, and its transmission is the equivalent of inheriting money and goods from one's parents. Birthright citizenship might be considered analogous to property transfers in several ways. Bounded membership carries with it a right to exclude, It preserves unequal accumulation of wealth and power in the hands of heirs. And citizens of wealthy countries, similar to property owners, are provided with enhanced opportunities to fulfill their potential. By contrast, citizens of poorer countries are often trapped by the lottery of their birth in straitened circumstances with very few opportunities. The trap is set by the arbitrary consideration of which country one is lucky or unlucky enough to be born into. Now, if we accept this characterization, then the immigration of people between states, poorer states and richer ones, begins to look a bit like an individual initiated wealth and privilege redistribution. Immigration becomes a way that those from poor and less secure countries can act and rectify the inequalities that they've inherited. By moving, they may be able to gain access to better remunerated jobs, improved healthcare, improved opportunities for their children. They can even help those left at home through the sending of remittances. So now we have an argument in which excluding the aspiring entrant is ethically problematical, not because it violates her individual liberty to move freely, but because it limits on an arbitrary basis access of the individual to the same goods and the same opportunities others enjoy. This seems to capture a very important reason why many intuitively feel immigration restrictions may be unjust. Would we be concerned about them if all the countries in the world had roughly similar living standards? What can we say about this argument, though? One thing we should note is that this argument is a remedial one, unlike the argument from freedom. Opening borders serves as a form of compensation for people due to the maldistribution of opportunity across societies. Given this, we might ask, would it not make more sense to move resources and opportunities to people where they are than to eliminate barriers to entry to other states? And this is exactly what Untitled Chapter argues in the Birthright Lottery. She suggests that we should tax rich states rather than demand that they open their borders, just like we do with other forms of inherited advantage, and then redistribute the money and resources to worse off societies. This response has some plausibility, and it chimes well with the desire that many have to avoid a brain drain or perhaps a movement of talented and resourceful people out of the country. It also addresses the issue of those who cannot and do not want to move from poorer countries. Perhaps, as the philosopher Varda once put it, morally rich countries face a choice: open your wallets or open your borders. Immigration controls then can only be morally legitimate in a world of far more equal distribution of wealth and opportunities. However, we might also reply that addressing poverty and inequality, especially when they have structural and institutional causes, is a long-term and difficult business. Even with the best will in the world, redistribution may be undermined by self-serving interventions, corruption, and by unintended consequences. By contrast, migration can be achieved quickly and definitively by individuals and their families. Its generational effects can be profound, and remittances can be very effective at getting to those who need them. Thus, it may still be a powerful case for the aspiring immigrant to demand entry, given certain empirical assumptions about the world. Now, an altogether different argument that the aspiring entrant might make is, you have no right to stop me from entering because I never participated in making the law by which you now exclude me. This position has been developed most powerfully by the Canadian philosopher Arash Abizadeh, He argues that current immigration restrictions that give states a unilateral right to determine who enters do not pass the test of democratic legitimacy. Let me explain this claim. In Western societies, it's common to think of democracy and restrictive laws on immigration as going hand in hand. Political entrepreneurs often try to whip up xenophobic tendencies amongst the electorate to justify immigration restrictions. And this hostility then restricts the policies that even those politicians that might want more open policies can then implement. Hence, strict policies become the order of the day. However, according to Abizadeh, the immigration restrictions our societies currently impose have not really been democratically validated. To see why, we need to understand that democracy is a way of legitimating state coercion. States with the authority of law coerce us all the time. Laws make us pay taxes, obey road rules, and adhere to a myriad other laws, lest we be subject to sanctions like fines and imprisonment. In a democracy, this coercion is legitimate only when it emerges through a procedurally just process, one in which all who are subject to the law have an equal say in what the law will be. In some versions of democracy, we have this say directly. In others, by representatives. But the central idea is that we give ourselves law through some kind of democratic process. But note who the we is here. According to democratic theory, it is everyone coerced by the state's laws, everyone subject to them. If people are coerced by the law, but excluded from participating in its making, they are subjects of domination. That is why historically various groups like women, blacks, the working class fought so hard to be enfranchised. Without the vote, you're a subject, not a citizen. So what I've said so far is quite widely accepted, but the twist that Abizadeh applies is to call our attention to the way that immigration control laws coerce prospective immigrants as much as they do citizens. We see this coercion most clearly when the state acts with direct force by deporting non-citizens, detaining asylum seekers, or towing boats of aspiring entrants away from their territory. But the coercion doesn't end there. People are still subject to the state's coercion, even if force is simply threatened. If I decide not to go to a protest rally because my government has declared it to be illegal, I'm still being coerced, even if I don't go, or perhaps even if I never wanted to go. Similarly, immigration restrictions are coercing immigrants, even if they have no intention of entering the state in question, or they decide not to. If this makes current immigration laws democratically illegitimate, how could they be made legitimate? Immigrants need, Abizadeh argues, to be able to participate in the making of the state's immigration laws through some kind of transnational democratic institutions. If those non-citizens could vote in such institutions, the laws chosen would look quite different, one can assume, from those we have today. Laws would reflect the interests of those currently excluded. But because such institutions don't currently exist, any immigration laws that currently are enforced are prima facie illegitimate and should be abandoned. Now, this is a novel argument, and many have actually found it convincing, but some have objected that coercion does not always require legitimation. If I want to stop a drunk person driving home, I don't need to win their consent to take their keys from them. Our society then might be justified under some circumstances, in unilaterally repelling entrants. Others have argued that aspiring entrants are not being coerced at all, contra apisade, by immigration laws. When we coerce someone, we dominate them. We force them to do what we want them to do. When we live in a state and are subject to ongoing laws, we're clearly being dominated if we cannot participate in the making of those laws. But immigration restrictions and their impact on those outside the state are not really like this. They simply prevent people from pursuing one option, entering our state, and leave lots of other options available to the individuals concerned. If I tell a student who wants to audit my class that they can't because I don't want the numbers to be too large, am I coercing this student by denying them entry or just preventing them from taking my course? That said, even if this is right, if I decided to drag that student away from my classroom or hold them for an extended period, things that we do by analogy commonly to migrants, it's hard to deny in these circumstances that we are indeed coercing them. Now, a final claim that the aspiring entrant could make is this: I have the right to enter because I am, in some relevant sense, a member of, or at least not really a stranger to, your political community. In this view, recently defended by a number of scholars, colonial relationships undermine the right of former colonizing countries to treat immigrants as foreigners and therefore as excludable. The key idea at work here was presaged almost 40 years ago in a rather surprising corner, writing about why the US had an obligation to take refugees from the Vietnam War in the late 1970s. The American political theorist Michael Walzer argued that the injury we in the US have done to them makes for an affinity between us. Thus, Vietnamese refugees were effectively Americanized before they arrived on US shores. The view that relations of harm and exploitation make for affinities similar to shared membership has found a new lease of life in discussions of colonial legacies. The legal scholar Tendai Achume has suggested that the ongoing consequences of colonialism undermine the claim that first world nations have the right to exclude any third world migrants, including current unauthorized economic migrants. She stated that citizens of the third world countries in which first world countries intervene should not be considered political strangers. Instead, they are political siblings or cousins with rights that should include entry and inclusion through migration. In this view, the exploitative and intrusive practices of colonialism, which, she argues, still benefit richer states today, make the denizens of southern states subjects of northern power and coercion, and in so doing, undermine the idea that they are simply aliens or foreigners. While Achume argues that all northern states are implicated in colonialism because they've benefited from an exploitative world economy, Nuti and Amaghetti have developed a more limited and nuanced claim that connects the membership relationship to countries with a specific colonial history. Distinctively, their approach grounds membership in a shared cultural, historical identity rather than economic or political subjection as such. They argue that over time, the colonial relationship transforms the colonizer and the colonized in ways that create an interdependent conception of the national self, a fusing of their identity so strong that it lives on even after independence. Borrowing from post-colonial work, and in particular Edward Said, they call this a situation of intertwined histories, and it emerges even under relations of brute inequality and repression. This intertwinement creates amongst the colonized a category of persons who are strictly speaking co-nationals of the colonizing society. Sorry, who are not strictly speaking co-nationals of the colonizing society, but who are part of the national community. They are thus part of the self that is the self-determining community that we might think legitimizes immigration control. As such, members of former colonial societies are not foreigners and should have the right to enter and to reside in the colonizing community, though they argue there is no reciprocal right for the colonizers to do the same. For example, the UK cannot rightfully refuse Jamaicans and Indians entry to their society because these people are effectively a part of its own national community. Now, this post-colonial argument for entrance intriguingly twists traditional ideas of self-determination in ways that become a moral resource for people currently excluded. But it also raises some questions. First, there's disagreement amongst post-colonial scholars on the scope of the membership relationship. Some argue that it holds just between people from former colonized countries and the countries that colonized them, others between colonized countries and all countries that benefit from the historical effects of colonialism. Another more troubling concern is that if those from former colonized countries must be considered part of the national community of countries that colonized them, are the members of the countries that have done the colonizing reciprocally part of the community of former colonized countries? If so, would this not mean that the citizens of richer countries like the UK and France have a moral right to enter and reside in former colonized countries? Oddly, this membership view seems to suggest that former colonized countries, however independent they now see themselves as, are morally unable to shrug off colonial relationships. Let me then head towards conclusion. It seems that each of these arguments that I've presented for constraining and in some cases eliminating immigration restrictions has some force. Each helps us to clarify what one might mean when it's claimed that immigrants are being unjustly excluded from entry. Yet these arguments are not equivalent to each other. Their implications lead in slightly different directions because of their different rationales: freedom, liberty, equality, historical membership, and highlight the claims of contrasting groups of rights holders: everyone, the poor, the demos, the colonized, and different duty holders: all states, richer states, democratic states, and colonizing countries. Now, there's no reason, however, why these arguments can't be considered complementary. If we were to provide a moral justification for why society shouldn't stifle freedom of speech, we would probably want to appeal to a range of different arguments. And there's no reason to believe why it should be any different with arguments that stifle free movement, free entrance. That said, even if we find some of the rights claims outlined here convincing, there's still more to be said. There may, for example, be morally relevant considerations that override a particular right in certain circumstances. Even proponents of free movement would support restrictions during states of emergency, arguably like the current COVID situation, and perhaps when immigration is likely to occur in such volume that it overwhelms highly important elements of a society's culture, such as the dominant language, perhaps. Nonetheless, the different arguments that I've presented here take us some way to understanding why, even if their current political impact is relatively small, challenges to immigration restrictions are likely to grow in the years ahead. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Matthew. That was very clear and comprehensive. I think one of the things you do that's fascinating is provide people with a toolbox of arguments that they can use to think critically about these issues, but also deploy those arguments, no matter sort of where they sit within the debate, to argue better and argue more persuasively as to why different types of immigration regime may be ethically justifiable or not. So thank you for that. We've now got time for questions. So if you have a question or a point to make, please enter it in the chat or Q&A box. But while we're waiting for some of those responses to come up, perhaps I could start by picking you up on the last point you left with. You suggest on your final slide that the different arguments you've presented may sort of, over time, come to the fore and allow greater challenges to the legitimacy of immigration control. Now, you're a political theorist in the sense that you're interested in the arguments about what should be, but with another hat on, you're also a political scientist interested in what is. And so I want to ask a question that relates to those two, which is in a way, what you think explains why some of these arguments become used by political elites and others are not used by political elites. What explains why you think some of these arguments end up being very present and influential in debates about immigration and others are not. For instance, we rarely hear the types of post-colonial arguments that you articulate used in elite political discourse. We tend to hear stronger arguments from the immigration control side about economic arguments, security arguments, identity arguments. We may hear some arguments about rights, about legitimacy, about liberty, but historical legacies are less part of it. So it's a very big, broad question. But I'm wondering what you think explains why some of these arguments are present in the political debate and others are less picked up on and less prevalent. Is it about power? Is it just some of them are a bit complicated? What explains when and why you think some of them are picked up and others are not?
Yeah. Thanks, Alex. It's a very good question and a slightly difficult question to answer. The first thing I would say is we never know when an argument is going to be picked up. And I think that's one of the interesting things about the current time. And I would give here the example of the Black Lives Matter movement at the moment. So there was a lot of kind of scholarship, a lot of work done on reparations and on Black history and all sorts of moral arguments there made for a long time in the US that really seemed to lack any kind of political resonance whatsoever. But now, and we'll see how far this goes, are finding that they're on a certain kind of fertile soil. And that's purely because of a kind of one singular event, I suppose, that exposed and brought home the kind of complaints about discrimination and the picking out of discrimination that lots of marginalized people have been complaining for a long time. So that's not even really a kind of institutional matter there. That's something of how political events can change things. On the other kinds of arguments, I think that generally the kind of historical colonial arguments have the problem that there's been, certainly in this country, there hasn't been much stomach, I suppose, to kind of reckon with Britain's imperial history, honestly. So the idea of linking immigration to that profoundly has fallen on quite unfertile ground. But arguments about freedom, liberty, equality, they can partly, they are extant in the political debate. And part of the reason for that is institutional. The EU has brought them to the fore. The linking to some pretty profound economic interests have created a form of argument and discussion, and perhaps even a kind of model that we've now moved away from, admittedly with Brexit, that provided some model of what elements of free movement would look like, and linked them to arguments about liberty, I suppose, and freedom, reciprocal freedom between members of the EU. So, I mean, so I think that's, I think various institutions can play a big role there, and what exists. But more importantly, the way that we have our democratic politics structured at the moment, where, and here we come back to the democratic point, that it's the demos who basically decide, or who have the most interest, the current citizens of the state, in influencing our particular immigration laws, also control the kinds of arguments that are likely to be successful over time. We can break into those arguments, and sometimes that happens, events happen too, new institutions happen, but nonetheless, I think that the dominant way of what which politics evolves in terms of immigration has to do with the fact that our regimes are structured democratically to valorize, to privilege the viewpoints of citizens and their interests.
Very interesting. And while we're waiting for other questions to emerge from the audience, and feel free to enter them in the chat box, I'll just follow up on that if I may. I mean, I think it's, from what you described, there's the possibility that as we enter a moment of greater awareness of the historical legacies of colonialism, of slavery, empire, etc., and we have more and more publicly engaged conversation about the historical legacies of figures like Colston and Rhodes. Do you think there's the possibility that these can bring Abizadeh, Achume, Nuti and Amaghetti's arguments to the fore? And if so, how, when I listen to those arguments, do we potentially distinguish between the different sources of historical claim to the right to international movement? Because in a way, one of the elements that's in those arguments is interdependence, that it's about the fact of interdependence, that there were historical links through empire that effectively expand the boundaries of the polity that should be included in decision-making about borders and the right to move. Another element, though, is really about power and oppression, that historically forms of oppression through governance, but also oppression through socioeconomic ties and economic exploitation are also part of the argument. And another element is just the way in which, aside from interdependence, aside from power, there's a need to reevaluate history and to see those historical connections. Now, if we go down the interdependence path, well, in a globalized world, those interconnections are very broad. If we go through down the path of power and oppression, well, different forms of power and oppression are everywhere. How do you think we could begin to make sense of those arguments vis-a-vis an immigration debate in a way that wasn't necessarily just open to all claims by everyone on a global scale? How could we think about disaggregating that argument to make it accessible, applicable, and relevant to the contemporary context? And what types of distinction could be made other than, for instance, a tie through a particular colonial link or a particular form of very recent socioeconomic oppression? How would we think about that?
That's a very big question, Alex. And I'm not completely sure of the answer of in terms of how I would go through that. I think that you're absolutely right, however, to point out that this last category I talked about, this membership category connected to issues of post-colonial membership, does take us in very different directions. On the one hand, there is a kind of distributive justice element in that argument, which is leading a kind of a direction which suggests that there has to be some kind of compensation or redistribution for the economic exploitation that various colonized societies suffered, and arguably with some of these approaches continue to suffer through a world economy that's rigged in terms of various northern countries and former colonial countries. On the other hand, you have this kind of interconnected view of identity and history and a kind of cultural view, which opens up, I suppose, modes of rethinking what the nation actually is here. And that can be quite, I suppose that can be quite powerful in some ways, in the sense that there is a strong interest, I think, in talking about and kind of explaining how particular people got to our society and what were the conditions under which our society was connected to those people in the past. I suppose there are dangers that in both of those kinds of arguments, it's very difficult once you've kind of opened them to kind of specify particular individual groups when the effects of those kind of interconnections, especially if we're talking about the world economy, and even if you're talking about the British Empire and its ability to kind of spread across the world, leads you in a kind of direction where you're going to end up having obligations to almost everyone on the planet if you make the right expansive kind of empirical argument. And some people go in that direction, like I think Achume does, you know, arguing that people from the South have absolutely no, actually have a right to enter all northern countries. But I mean, even they limit it too, because if you're going to take the colonial argument seriously, then it's going to imply to some southern colonizing countries too that have histories. One example of that, or at least a medium power, would be Indonesia in relation to East Timor. So I'm not exactly sure how one is going to pin that down at the end of the day. What I will say is that practically, the way it may be pinned down is not so much at the kind of level of principle, though one could try to do that. We're still very much the kind of first generation of thinking through these issues, but it will be done by the kind of political lobbies and political groups that express their views and arguments profoundly at particular points in time. And I think with something like the Black Lives Matters arguments, certain kinds of colonial relationships are going to be the ones that kind of receive attention here and are more likely perhaps to make an impact here. But there's no reason to believe that these debates will not be ongoing and open up other kinds of questions, just like arguments about the franchise and who should be included in it evolved over time to include all sorts of different groups.
Fantastic. We've got a great set of questions now coming in. Francis Stewart asks, pre-World War I, there were basically no restrictions on international mobility. What do you think explains the huge switch there has been? So I mean, very interesting to realize something that we now sort of take for granted is actually in some ways a relatively recent historical creation, really only emerging over the last 100 years. Historically, how do you explain that?
Yeah. So first of all, hello, Francis. Thank you for the question. The pre-World War, I mean, traditional explanations have to do with actually World War I as really leading to very much processes of security and the erecting of borders and hostility towards other countries led to the emergence of borders in those contexts, and through creating a context where there was a lot of kind of dramatic fear of outsiders and enemy infiltration into those societies. I mean, I mean, it wasn't just World War One. If you go back to the US and perhaps Australia, you're also finding in the 1890s, and at least from the 1890s, there are growing immigration restrictions based largely on race towards Chinese migrants and migrants from Asia generally. But I think just the kind of very security-oriented environment during World War One played a powerful role there. And once you had set up a system of passport control, there was a kind of knock-on effect, I suppose, of the state increasingly intervening in that role and controlling the movement of outsiders. Another factor that should probably connect to that, which is less directly security related and race related, is the development of various rights and protections for workers over that period, to the development of unions, the development of the welfare state, at least in the periods from the 1930s and 1940s, created powerful lobbies for forms of restriction on open labour coming into various countries, in particular Western countries.
And another big question from Anne Irfan, where do borders and specifically their arbitrary nature feature in these various arguments? Are there any theorists you mentioned grounding their critique of immigration restrictions in claims around the arbitrariness of state borders to start with?
Yeah, that's a good question. That does emerge in some issues from time to time. And indeed, if you go back to, if I can self-promote, my book, The Politics and Ethics of Asylum, I think one of the arguments made there, and it's an argument that others have made too, certainly in subsequent years, but I'm not sure, I don't think I invented it off the top of my head, but that even if there are certain kinds of community claims to self-determination, for example, and the right of a community to say, preserve, whatever that means, its particular way of life, that doesn't necessarily give countries the right to exclude people from territory. Why does that particular community claim map onto or justify the occupation of a particular territory, especially given what we know about the historical construction of borders and their very arbitrariness, and the fact that they're artifacts generally of power rather than some kind of consensual dividing up of lines that could be impartially justified. So there is a bit of work on that, on trying to separate out those two kinds of claims and saying, even if you have some kind of communal claim, you don't necessarily have that kind of territorial claim. And one way to kind of open up that claim practically would be to say that maybe people have the right to enter particular territories, but that doesn't automatically give them the right to citizenship in that territory. Maybe separate kinds of claims at work there. But the territorial issue is hugely morally vexed, because we're dealing with claims that particular groups have now and have historically got used to. And also we cannot just kind of, I suppose, create a world of divided borders just from scratch according to some kind of ideal principle. At least the history of doing things like that is a very poor and dangerous one. So it may be that a better way around that is to concede that people should have the right to move freely to where they want to be because of the weakness, the moral weakness of certain kinds of territorial claims.
Thank you very much, Matt. We've reached 3 o'clock, but there is one last question. So I'm just going to read it out in the hope that you could possibly give a very quick response. Again, it's quite a large question and I'll paraphrase it. It says, your talk gave me a lot to think about. Migrants are now often placed in opposition to citizens in political and public discourse. And through that, the nation state is defined by the existence of immigrants. if we were to end immigration control, would we be effectively reconceiving and reconstructing the nation state as we know it? And if so, what would it look like? Again, massive question, but if there's a couple of sentences of thoughts on that, we'll take them before we finish.
I think it's an interesting question. So I mean, coming back to what I said in answer to that other question, we have a situation perhaps in Europe where we've had a situation of the EU, and we've allowed people to move freely between different societies in the European context, and to live there as long as they're Europe, opening up a huge space for free movement, albeit one that still excludes large parts of the world's population. And it doesn't seem to have put an end to the nation state in those circumstances. Certainly didn't seem to put an end to the British nation state over the period in question. So it's possible that if we think about some kind of federal relationship or some distinction between what it is to be a member of society and what it is to be able to kind of move freely in and out of that society and perhaps claim membership after extended residence, it's still possible you could have some form of kind of national membership on the one hand, but combine that with much more open borders on the other. Of course, I think if you did that, you'd have to tell a very liberal and open story and pluralistic story about what the nation is, effectively. But that is what liberal states should be doing anyway, albeit that they don't always do that.
Matthew, thank you very much for taking us on a fascinating ethical and normative journey. You've explored these issues with characteristic accessibility to different pathways, the arguments, and you've engaged with all of the questions brilliantly. So thanks so much for joining us on Oxford Development Talks, and thank you to everyone who joined us from home. And I'm sure many other people, Matthew, will be fascinated to watch the talk when we publish it on the series website. So thanks to you, and thanks to everyone, and thanks to Law and Joe in the background who have been managing this series.
Thanks. Bye. Bye. Okay, thanks, Alex.
Thank you.
Good afternoon.